All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, one of the macro predictions I've been willing to make here in recent months is that we are likely headed to an economic boom, the likes of which America really hasn't seen in many years. I'm the first to acknowledge the failures of the CARES Act in 2020, Trump's own ineptitude, and Biden's failure to reimagine the American economy. But one lesson that I took away with the number of voters who gave Trump credit for the state of the 2020 economy is that even marginal improvements can produce outsized political benefits. Which is why, even though I am optimistic about our country's future in the short to medium term, I can't help but note a core theme of this show. Trump and Biden's refusal to take the coronavirus pandemic to make major structural changes to the U.S. economy means that the next boom and inevitable bust are locked into the current paradigm, and that while I predict Biden will be very popular in the coming months while reaping the rewards of the stimulus package and vaccines, that in the long run, we could be on track for some of the worst politics we've ever seen if current trends continue. Let me explain. The New York Times recently published a close-up geographical view of nearly all 180 million Americans who voted in the 2020 presidential election. The maps are fascinating. If you zoom out, the results aren't that surprising. Quote, Republicans typically dominate in most southern and plain states, Democrats in northeastern and west coast ones. Democrats cluster in urban America, Republicans in more rural places. But when you keep zooming in, that's when things get really interesting. New research, which pieced together the individual addresses of registered voters, found that, quote, it's not just that many voters live in neighborhoods with few members of the opposite party. It's that nearly all American voters live in communities where they are less likely to encounter people with opposing politics than we'd expect. That means, for example, that even in a neighborhood where Democrats make up 60% of the voters, only 50% of a Republican's nearest neighbors might be Democrats. The dynamic plays out at every level of analysis, within states, within cities, within individual neighborhoods. According to this new research, even if you Democrats and Republicans are roughly equally split in the same zip code, they are almost certain to live separately within that zip code. It's a dynamic which, while present for a long time, was accelerated by Trump, and the COVID pandemic and embedded within it is the story of America. One of the best predictors on if you're white and you voted Democrat or Republican in the 2020 election is, do you have a 4-year college degree? Of course, there are many exceptions, but on average, the number one thing dividing us today is simple. If you went to a 4-year degree institution, you're overwhelmingly more likely to vote Democrat and for Biden. And if you didn't, you're much more likely to vote Republican and for Trump. The educational divide is profound because it's also an indicator generally of economic status. Knowledge workers with college degrees are congregating en masse in major metropolitan areas across America, while non-college educated voters are much more likely to forego internal migration and live near or in the place that they were raised. This creates literally two Americas. As the number of college-educated voters has increased, they've built their own worlds with their own restaurants and cultural norms. And these cultural norms dominate the commanding heights of everything in America: corporate leadership, Hollywood, newspapers, universities. In effect, the trendsetters and the people who decide what people consume and they don't. And at the very same time, the entire other half of the country has their own world too, one which is dramatically disconnected from all of this, and who are increasingly bewildered because they can't recognize the language, the norms, and understand viscerally that this domination is an implicit attack on their way of life. All of this is just to say, this is really bad for the future of our country. Because if this is where things stand right now, after a boom, it's actually going to look worse. Cash flowing into the pockets of upper middle class Americans and knowledge workers means they will buy more property, they will consolidate more, they will build new institutions, and in general, their power will be cemented. Meanwhile, yes, some will be seen in less educated communities that there are, as always, but they're much less likely to reap exponential rewards that the others will. And I can't underscore how bad it is to have an economy which intentionally sorts Americans apart from one another. So think about so many of our current fights and how informed they are by geographical polarization. Blue state bailouts. Why do you think that appeals to many GOP voters? Because they literally don't know anyone, friends or family, who live in those states. It's easy to deny them. On the other side, remember that entire discourse about how the U.S. should lop red states off because they're poor and they cost a lot of money in social services, and how we'd be better off with Canada? One thing that the researchers pointed out, which showed me how really screwed we are, is this. In times of crisis, the test of whether communities coalesce or not is really put to the test. Can people put their partisan differences aside and come together? And I nearly snorted while saying that because all of us are going through a horrific pandemic. And just think about how polarized the responses and norms around what to do have been. The extreme end of Blue America is wearing 3 masks and a face shield to walk their dog with a "Thank you, Dr. Fauci" sign in their front yard, and who are adamant schools and offices can't be reopened until every person in America is vaccinated. In Red America, masks are seen as a cultural weakness, and they've largely been abandoned. Going out to eat is seen as a way to rage against the machine. Currently, 50% of Republicans who haven't been vaccinated say they don't even want it. We need to think long and hard about how this happened, because our response to the pandemic culturally has been a failure. We only got even more divided in a time we actually needed to come together. And the more physically distant that we are from each other, the more we are likely to develop hatred when compassion is what's needed most. It's probably one of the most pressing challenges that we face. And unfortunately, the one chance that we really had to do anything about it is slipping past our grip. Crystal, that data is really stark because we see this all the time, which is that when people are like, oh, city folks and non-city folks, it's like, no, even in cities, people are sorted, right? Like there are the people at the top in the city, and there are the people who serve them, Uber Eats drivers, waiters, serve staff, everybody in the service economy, and not necessarily in the knowledge economy. And then that trickles down in geographic polarization at the starkness of almost every single level of analysis. And it's the worst polarization, partisan geographical segregation that we've ever seen in modern American history, almost since the 1860s, really, when you think about it.
And as you point out, it becomes much easier to otherize someone when you have basically no interaction with them. There's a 2008 book by Bill Bishop called The Big Sort.
Oh, yeah.
And it's phenomenal, and it identifies exactly this trend, which is that at the big level, like when you're just looking at the states, you see the way that things are, people are sorting themselves out and becoming polarized, but it doesn't matter what geographical unit you look at. You can zoom all the way in to go block by block and still see this sorting pattern occurring. And it's not because like the government's forcing you to live in this neighborhood or that neighborhood. It's that as we become distinct culturally, people just naturally gravitate towards, if you're a liberal, you naturally gravitate to the community that's walkable and maybe more downtown and it's got the coffee shops, etc. So even within classes, if you have Republicans, they may prefer to be, in the suburbs, they may prefer to be in the different communities. You just see the way that this sorting occurs. I actually thought about it a lot when I moved to Kentucky. Kentucky's a red state, right? But of course, the neighborhood that I preferred and happened to choose in Louisville was extraordinarily liberal and progressive, right? Everybody had Black Lives Matter signs in their yards. It wasn't because I thought to myself, like, I want to live with people who think like I do. It just was the neighborhood that had the amenities that appealed to me and my family most. That sorting is happening in neighborhood after neighborhood, block after block, all across America. And it has massive implications in terms of culture. It has massive implications, certainly in terms of our politics. The other piece of this that you identify is, if we're heading into a roaring 20s kind of a situation, guess what happened after the roaring 20s?
I have to keep giving that warning. I'm like, everyone remember, it's not a good story.
Right. After the roaring 20s came the Great Depression.
Yes.
And that is exactly the kind of spiral that we seem to be potentially heading towards when you have, you're going to have an economy that booms, but you haven't dealt with any of the structural underlying situation that led to this massive inequality that we've been experiencing for years and years. And of course, coronavirus just accelerated that. So yes, I think what you've identified here and what this data shows is actually one of the most important and significant pieces here. And you can see culturally how we are coming apart. You can see how, look, it used to be CEOs, they made a lot of money, but it was like, 100 times.
Like 30 times.
Yeah, it was like 30 times what the average workers do. Now it's like 1,000 times.
300,000 times.
And they don't even see themselves as much a part of America as like part of this global elite. That's who they identify with, and that's who they culturally are more similar to than other people, who they're workers that are working in their shops or factories, etc. The last thing I'll say here is one of the places where you used to have a great mixing of cultures and ideologies all in one place was the union hall. And so also with the decline of unions, you lose out on that kind of practical, we're actually working together towards a similar goal and we've got to deal with our differences face to face. You lose out on one more institution where that used to occur. So
yeah,
it's not a good
it's
situation.
really bad. And that's my last bullet point is I'm like, yeah, like we might have a boom, but what's going to, and I guess what depresses me is that people are so, I think, not downtrodden, but are just so unused to the idea that radical change can happen in their lives, that, you know, a modest 2 or 3% wage increase is something that they're willing to be like, yeah, the economy's working for me.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, it's not. You're still a household debt, and you've got insurance premiums out, you know, and then you've got car note you can barely pay, and like you're not living paycheck to paycheck, but you're like one paycheck away from total bankruptcy. But people are so used to living paycheck to paycheck, when they have that marginal increase in their lives, they're like, oh, you know, that's okay. And look, there's very little that you can change about that. More, what I'm trying to get at is that the bottom can fall out of this very quickly, and that because people are just so used to this bifurcated economy, that the more that happens, that in, you know, say 20 years, who knows how long the boom will last? I don't know. It could last 5 years, it could last 20. Well, in 20 years, if it, you know, continues to pull apart, and you already see this across every major metropolitan area, like Maricopa County is physiologically just different than everything else in Arizona. Fulton County and Atlanta as well is just different than the rest of Georgia. Here in D.C., different, or whatever, in Virginia, Northern Virginia, Southern Virginia. And in every single one of these places, like the cultural norms just split apart. The major metropolitan areas are like this unistate, you know, where everybody kind of consumes the same food, same exercise, like same cultural norms. And then if you have no mixing with your other fellow citizens, it just leads to a very bad political place. And I think that the pandemic shows that, right? The masks, the culture wars, and then the blue state bailouts, and then, you know, like I think we're gonna have a red and blue America whenever it comes to reopening. Like look at Florida, and then Texas, and then you're gonna have on the other side many other states, and I think that's terrible. I really do.
Yeah, and you can also, there's been some theorizing about the way that people may move out of the major metros and spread out, with remote work becoming the norm. But even if they move, you know, even if they move to Texas, they're going to move to Austin, and they're going to be in like the, you know.
And I like Austin.
Austin's great. Yeah, no, I mean, this is not, look, I don't think this is a point of like judging one bubble or the other, but everybody's in a bubble, and it's increasing, like that level of separation, polarization, not being able to even comprehend or understand the life or the culture of other people in the country, that's only growing, and it's hard to see that the outcomes are going to be good.
Yeah, that's right. All right, I'm looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.